Brule. This is Steve Brule, and it is coffee time. This is an informal session, as you know, where I go over some of the things that I've come across or have come across my desk in the last day or so, or since the last coffee break session, which was Saturday. Today, we're having a look at marriage and how it's presented in the media to men as well, and how, at least what I think, how it pertains to men's lives. And I suspect you've heard some of my opinions on this before, but not put possibly in quite this way. Before I carry on, I'll acknowledge some of the regulars in the comment section already. We have Salty Cracker, Mr. Fix-It. I think some of these are new fellows, I see. The Great Indoors 1979. Welcome to the show. Matt Harden, Cyrus Mohammed Xerxes. I don't remember that name before. Palmer Organic Farms. Welcome to the show. As you can see, I have my Patriarchy VIP Club member card on display, which authorizes me to comment on all the comings and goings and carryings on of the global evil feminist empire, which has its tentacles spread right around the world, with thousands upon thousands of highly well-funded and organized feminist organizations internationally. As you probably saw from the thumbnail, we have a very well-known fellow on the thumbnail, Harry, who is now becoming an example for all men, an example of where not to go, how not to live your life. So without any further ado, let's start with a meme here that I came across recently. Reading from the top, when you sell your engraved multi-thousand-dollar one-of-a-kind pair of handmade hunting rifles because your wife doesn't like hunting. That does sum up quite a bit of this, actually. And let's step a little bit further here. I want to make sure I have the right issues to display here. Harry is a good place to start on this because obviously Harry is not innocent in this. Harry went down this road voluntarily. But Harry's example is showing what can happen to a man. So what do we have here today in today's world? We have men are being lied to. We're being lied to by the media. We're being lied to by our culture about what is marriage. We're being lied to in the sense of being encouraged to go down a road which is not in our best interest. Like every period in history, men are lied to in order to convince them to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of society, specifically for women and the wealthy. Those in power of the society benefit from men's sacrifices. This is why there's such a press on to convince men that marriage is still good for them. But most men do not have any idea how miserable a woman can make their home until they've been married. And there's nothing you can do about it. Any attempt to stop her from being an insufferable idiot when she's being an insufferable idiot, and of course, women, like every human being, they're not always insufferable idiots. But when a woman decides to be an insufferable idiot, it can lead to the man being put in jail on the word of his wife and the loss of everything he's worked for, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. So let's look a little bit at Harry here. Just glancing at the comments here for you. With you here, Alt Drop, Nurture is in here, Salty Cracker, welcome to the show. Here's a headline. Harry abandoned his royal life. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle will abandon their royal titles. This was January 2020. We're all familiar with this. And whose decision do you think this is? I don't think that was in Harry's mind at all before he met Meghan. Probably the furthest thing from his mind. But yet, Harry has abandoned his royal titles. And this obviously has caused a lot of stress in his real genetic birth family. That's what it is here. This is a man who has denounced his family after getting involved with Meghan Markle. Let's read another headline here. What's happening with Harry? Harry has to give up 3 honorary military appointments when he steps down. So he's also abandoned the military life, which in all reports indicate that he quite liked. He quite liked the military life, but he had to abandon that too. And here's the military response. Let's read this title from the top. We have lost respect for you. The military figures dismayed by Duke of Sussex's behavior. They have lost respect for Harry. Well, doesn't that say something? Let's read on here. This is a quick quote from that article. One of the Army most senior former officers urged Duke of Sussex to put Queen and country first as a former officer in the Royal Marines, of which the Duke is Captain General. He said he would not raise a toast to him. So after getting involved with Meghan Markle, he is losing the respect of his associates, his countrymen, and I think many of his previous friends. Let's carry on here. This other headline here. He also leaves his country for Meghan. Prince Harry and Meghan moved to California. And what else has he been doing? I mean, that's an awful lot of control. This one is there's so many red flags in this marriage that really it does warrant study for all men as an example of how bad it can get. So he's left his royal family. Has strife in his family. He's lost his military appointments. He's losing his friends, and he's moved to another country. Now, what else does he do? Prince Harry may quit hunting over Meghan's dislike of sport, says conservationist friend. And that friend is Dame Jane Goodall, who says the Duke of Sussex is finding departure from UK a bit challenging. So all of these things adding up to an extraordinarily controlling woman that he's got attached to. And the reality that we need to face when a man gets involved with a woman like this, somehow, one way or another, first of all, you've got to have your antennas on, and you've got to be watching for this sort of thing. But a controlling woman like this, he has no recourse, especially now that he's not connected to the royal family. So here, read this headline as well. Prince Harry reportedly sold his hunting rifles for £50,000 in order to, quote, please Meghan Markle. An ordinary man like you or I, we get involved with a controlling woman, there is no recourse. I think Harry has already become a walking shell of a man and a warning to all men everywhere. Marriage has been a growing disaster for men for hundreds of years. It worked in primitive times, more primitive times, I would say, for survival, but that doesn't mean that it was good for men even then. So we're going to have a look at some of what Suzanne Venker has to say about this, because Suzanne Venker, in some sense of the word, is sympathetic to men's issues and men's rights advocacy. But her arguments are a little bit problematic to me, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But she's ultimately arguing for traditional marriage at a time when marriage has turned into an enormous liability and risk for men. She wants to preserve all the new female privileges and advantages, and keep all the historical privileges. As usual, this comes down to an argument for men to serve women even more, and for men to rescue women from the nightmare they themselves have created. Now, I'm just going to say a few words. Upon marriage, a woman's responsibilities almost entirely drop away. She can quit her job, stop doing any housework, withhold sex, sleep with her husband's best friend, spend every dime he has saved, and the man has absolutely no recourse. If he tries to protect the family money, he can be charged with financial abuse. If he dares to physically restrain her from assaulting him or the kids, he will likely be charged with domestic violence. If she doesn't enjoy the sex one night, she can charge him with marital rape. If she murders him, she can walk away claiming battered wife syndrome. And that is going on in a fashion in Canada already. It's not law, but already the Supreme Court has ruled a stay of prosecution against a woman who hired a hitman to kill her husband. This list can go on and on and on. The man's life and freedom, once married, is in the hands of his wife. He, on the other hand, will remain responsible for providing her continued comfortable lifestyle no matter the circumstances. No matter how horribly she treats him, he is liable to lose his house, his kids, his pension, his car, even his standing in the community solely on her word. Sure, he can divorce, but this decision comes with a huge price for the man and a huge jackpot for his wife. So marriage has become the modern version of indentured servitude. And yet still today, men are being shamed into marriage, told to man up, accused of failure to launch, of being toxic, manspreading, mansplaining, male privilege, etc., etc., etc. We've heard all kinds of shaming language from feminists, and it's accepted in everyday society, mainstream society. I'm here to say marriage is dead. And yet its rotting corpse still has a seat at the table, and it is stinking up our entire cultural home. It is time to bury it for good. There's no going backwards on this, as I'm going to point out through some of these examples. As the reality, marriage was never a good deal for men, not ever in history. It was an imposition on men in order to serve the stability of society. That worked. At one time, it did serve for stabilizing society and providing for women and protecting for women, but it doesn't have that purpose anymore. That no longer applies. And yet many prominent cultural critics, like Suzanne Venker, we're going to see, argue to preserve this institution. And I say, why? It is demonstrably and monstrously abusive of men. We should be reimagining ways to raise children without the nuclear family. And we should be reimagining ways to have a good and rich and fulfilling life without the institution of marriage. I know this sounds feministic in a sense because feminists have a war on marriage, but I'm suggesting that maybe they're right on this one. I don't think feminists really intended to destroy marriage. They just intended to complain about it and therefore get more leverage and power and control in our legal and cultural systems by complaining about it. They don't they never intended to destroy marriage. But I think we need to bury marriage. The fact is that feminists don't mean anything they say. It's all about keeping men and their culture on the defensive and responding to an infinite and unending series of complaints. So, without further ado, let's get on to have a look at what Suzanne Venker is saying here. And this one we touched on before, and I'm going to start with it again because it sets the tone here of Suzanne Venker's. I'm going to be critical of Suzanne here, even though at times she makes some good points. But there's an undertone here of blaming men, shaming men, and getting men back on the plantation. Here she says America is awash in over-mothered men. As we talked about before, this should be saying America is awash in mothering, smothering, domineering women, because that's where it's coming from. If there's over-mothered men, it's because there's domineering, smothering, controlling women out there. But Suzanne Venker places again the blame in this headline, at least, on the men. Let's have a look here. I had a quote from that article. Growing up fatherless or with a father a son rarely sees due to divorce or workaholism, yes, that's a thing, almost invariably stunts a boy's growth. The end result is almost always too much mother, which means boys will absorb too much femininity and none of the masculinity they need. Ergo, he will spend years trying to figure out what it means to be a man. Notice that it's growing up fatherless, as if the father abandoned the man. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fathers don't typically abandon the man. They are chased away by an angry, controlling, smothering mother, wife. But again, the tone here is to blame the man. They're even blaming him for workaholism when he's out there trying to provide for all the excessive demands of his wife in a world that's extraordinarily competitive for men. Let's read on here. A mother can't teach her son to be a man. She's indispensable to him when he's young, but his father is indispensable when he's older. These are all very good points. But then again, who's responsible for this? It's simply unreasonable to expect these boys to become men that boys with strong fathers become. That is true. That doesn't mean that marriage is the solution for this, though. I do have some ideas on that if we have time to get into it. Let's read from the top again. We have a hard time in this country acknowledging the problems that plague our boys and men, and we're too focused on women and girls to notice. But women suffer, and currently do suffer, just as much from men's failure to launch as do men themselves. We know this because we're forever hearing women ask where all the good men have gone. Well, here again, they're blaming, or she's crafting women as the equal sufferers when women themselves caused this problem. Failure to launch. There's a culture out there that is extraordinarily antagonistic towards young men and quite dangerous, in fact, and it's been put in place by feminist activism. All these laws destroying presumption of innocence that put men and young boys into quite serious peril. And yet, here it is, she's saying women suffer as much from men's, quote, failure to launch. Again, it's men's failure, women's suffering. I think this is not even that subtle, to be honest. And here, let's have a look at another one of her articles. Here, Suzanne Venker. Dear men, don't be so wussy with your wife. Wow, that's so easy to say when you're on the female side of it and you're not facing a domestic violence law that can destroy your life, put you in jail, and totally cause you to lose your job, your income, everything. Put you on the street without hope of recovery. That's the power that's been put into the hands of every woman, and this was put in the hands by activists, feminist activists, of which women in general, who even don't call themselves activists, didn't do anything to stand up for their own sons. And yet you're going to write an article like, don't be so wussy with your wife. You might as well say to the slaves, why are you being in the time of slavery? Don't be so wussy with your slave master. It's about the same thing you're saying here, Suzanne. Don't be so wussy with your slave master, you slaves. Why are you slaves so cowardly? There's only 18 shotguns pointed at your head and 14 whips. Don't be so wussy. Stand up for yourself as a slave. Let's read it from the article here. The fact is, too many men have abdicated their masculine leadership in the home. Well, that is true, but why? Are they not acting rationally? There is a nuclear bomb that can be set off by the little finger of his wife. That's been set up in the law. And you're going to sit there and blame men for taking a back seat, stepping back a little bit and being cautious? I don't think that's very reasonable. Let's read this from the top. If it's a woman and she's married, she's the main breadwinner. She's talking about some of her clients she talks to, or coaches. She's a coach, I guess. She's the main breadwinner and doesn't want to be. If it's a woman and she's not married, she's concerned about her boyfriend's lack of ambition. If it's a man and he's married or he's not married, he's aware that something in his relationship is off. All of this tone is about serving the woman's needs. You'll see this more clearly as this goes on. Let's read this from the top. The more your wife acts out, and the more she acts less like she did when you were dating and more like a disrespectful nag, the more she's crying out for you to take charge, blaming the man again. Not of her, but of yourself and of the situation at hand. She doesn't want to make all the decisions. She doesn't want you to, quote, do what you're told. She wants you to be stronger than she is so she can relax back into her feminine. Basically, she doesn't want to be the leader. That's your job. That might have worked before the marriage laws, the domestic violence laws, all stacked up like a army of bombs pointed directly at the man's head. We have stripped men of all power in the marriage. We have stripped men's power. Any sign of non-compliance on a man can be used by a woman to destroy him entirely. I know a lot of people are saying, yes, he has a choice. His choice should be made not to get married. And that's my point, because marriage is dead. Once you are married, your choices are much harder to make, because you cannot respond to an abusive wife without risking destroying your own life. The laws are that biased against men today in marriage and domestic violence laws. So the entire thrust of this show is to say, look, marriage has become indentured servitude for men. The husband today is nothing more than an indentured servant. He risks everything if he wants to get out of that marriage, everything. She stands to gain. She is compensated by the courts for the loss of her indentured servant. The parallels with the time of indentured servitude are quite strong. So yes, he can, and he probably should get out of an abusive marriage. I did. But that doesn't mean that marriage is not a corrupt institution. It is. It comes loaded against men and in favor of women. So that makes it a dead institution in my mind. And we no longer need the institution of marriage to stabilize society. That was one of its main purposes in the early days of the marriage institution. I think I missed a couple of donations here. I'm going to pause here and acknowledge Oki Migtau, who says, I wouldn't believe it if I didn't go through it. Yes, I feel exactly the same. And that is the point, is that after marriage, a woman can stop everything. She can become insufferable. She can stop doing dishes. She can quit her job. She can do whatever she wants to do, and there's nothing you can do about it as the man. Nothing you can do about it. There are no laws against her doing whatever she wants. And that's been the thrust of the feminist movement since the beginning, is to expand privileges for women, to give them increases of liberties without any concern about how it affects the society or how it affects the partners in marriage, and without any accompanying responsibilities for that. So let's read from the top. Just as you want your wife to be more feminine, she wants you to be more masculine. If you don't know what that looks like, you're not alone. But the sooner you learn, the happier you and your marriage will be. I say, sure, yes, women want men to be more masculine. I 100% agree with that. And the sooner you learn, the happier you will be. But you don't have to be in marriage. No matter what way you cut it or slice it, marriage is indentured servitude for men. You give up freedoms when you sign up for marriage, and you take on risks. And a woman gives up all responsibility and takes on all kinds of extra liberties. And in the event of a divorce, the court will compensate her for the loss of her indentured servant, you, the man. That is alimony. That is child support. That is your house, your car, your half your pension. All of that is to compensate the woman, the wife, for the loss of her indentured servant. Let's move on to another article here. Never stop wooing your wife. There's a theme right through Suzanne Venker's articles here that I've looked at relating to marriage and men and relationships that always puts the responsibility on the man, with a few exceptions. She does encourage women to be more feminine and all that stuff. But the entire thrust is a return to traditional marriage. And I say traditional marriage is dead because the law has turned traditional marriage into indentured servitude. All of these changes to domestic violence laws has placed so much power in the hands of women that it does add up to indentured servitude for men. So there's no going backwards. In fact, if you look at parables from the Bible and other religious texts, you see when I forget the names of the people leaving Sodom and Gomorrah, that one turns back and turns to stone, looks backwards, warned not to look backwards, or you turn to pillar of salt. And then there's the image of the cherubs protecting the gates to the Garden of Eden with fire and brimstone and spears and all the rest of that. That's to indicate that you cannot go backwards. It is dangerous and unwise to try and go backwards. And to try and reestablish the traditional marriage in our culture with our laws and realities today is a step backwards. I'm arguing here in this video that we need to reinvent relationships, intimacy, friendships. We need to reinvent what the core and most important relationships in our culture, what they look like. And in the meantime, scrap marriage, because it is not an institution to be supported in a freedom-loving society. So, never stop wooing your wife, men, because you're the servant. Let's read from the top. The fact is, men and women are different. Yeah, men are indentured servants in marriage and women are the owners. And in no realm is this more true than when it comes to sex. As a man, you're going to want sex more than your wife will. That is not true. Your wife is going to want sex with the hunk next door, even if she doesn't want sex with you. It's not that she doesn't want sex, it's that she doesn't want it with you. Once married, you're just an indentured servant to her. So here, let's read that again. As a man, you're going to want sex more than your wife will. I'm going to remind people that what Paul Elam says is quite true. If your wife turns off the sex and intimacy, you are not in any stretch restricted to your marital vows. She has then abdicated her responsibility in the marriage. You're perfectly acceptable for you to look for that intimacy and sex outside the marriage. And I tend to agree with Paul Elam's view on that. He published that recently. Let's read on. If for no other reason than it requires more to get her going than it takes you. Thus, having sex with her will take some effort. That also is nonsense. It is nonsense. I've seen women spin up and get wet on a dime in seconds with the right stimulus. The fact is that marriage itself puts men into the position of indentured servitude, and that itself is a huge turnoff for women. It's like a man marries some slim, gorgeous model, and then, two years later, she's 360 pounds. It's that much of a turnoff. You're an indentured servant to her. She doesn't see you the same way anymore. She would have been still in love with you and still turned on if you said, you know something, marriage is not for me. Let's read this from the top. At the end of the day, the best way to get sex from your wife is to revert back to how you accomplished it in the first place. Woo her. There it is. You're the indentured servant. Get to work. Keep wooing your master. You have to keep pleasing your master. This is what Suzanne Venker is arguing here. So, from the top, don't look sloppy, look nice. You hear that, indentured servants? Put down the phone and look her in the eye. Don't forget that one, indentured servants. Tell her how much you love her. Indentured servants have to love their masters. If she never stands still long enough to hear it, make her stand still. But be careful, because she could have you put in jail for doing that. Oh, and see what needs to be done around the house. Just do it rather than waiting to be asked. You see, that's what a good indentured servant does. A good indentured servant looks around to see if there's anything the master needs before the master even knows she needs it. To be a busy wife and mother, that's foreplay. To a busy wife and mother. Incredible how this all turns on the man, the indentured servant. Let's read from the top. As it happens, that's what most women want. Of course, they want an indentured servant, but that doesn't mean they're going to be turned on by you. There's going to be a Chad next door, or your best friend. She'll certainly bang him, and there's nothing you can do about it. According to Pew Research, the vast majority of mothers with children under 18, which is 67%, prefer part-time work or none at all. None at all. That's why they want the indentured servant. They don't want to work. 67% of women really don't want to work. And as Warren Farrell pointed out, was it Warren or was it that woman who manipulated men? But in any case, work for women has to be made fun. Women aren't going to do work that's work. Work for women is a hobby. And this is why they don't mind doing part-time work. And they're not just going to do part-time work that pays well. They're going to look for part-time work that is enriching to them, that is like a hobby. So there it is. That is why, and Suzanne Venker supports this, that is why women want to get married. It is indentured servitude for the man. To do that, it is crucial to marry the right man. That is right. You've got to get the most compliant and successful indentured servant before you marry. Of course she does. All of this comes down to trying to get the best deal for the woman. I'm going to pause here and acknowledge Zirank for his generous donation to Studio Brûlé. And Zirank says, put down the phone and look her in the eye. So you'll be attempting to look her in the eye between Instagram and Facebook postings. Yeah. And probably sending nude photos. She's probably sending nude photos to your best friend. But that doesn't matter. He's the indentured servant and she's the master. He's supposed to continue to please her. And, oops, we read that already. Here's another one from Suzanne. Let me just pop this up over here. So read the title with me from the top. When you're married, there's no such thing as his money and her money, by Suzanne Venker. And keep in mind, what did we just learn a minute ago? That women do not want to work. They want to marry the right man. They want to nab the right indentured servant so they don't have to work. And then the very next page we're seeing, there's no such thing as his money and her money. Of course not. He's the one out working. It's her money. He's the indentured servant. He doesn't get control of the money just because he worked for it. There's no such thing as his money in marriage. We know what that means. His money is her money. Let's read this from the top. When we get married, there's no such thing as his money and her money. There's only our money. Our money. Sure, right. With the exception of inheritance, which can produce its own relationship problems. When you're married, by law, all marital money is half hers and half his. There you go, indentured servants. That's what you're in for once you get married. Just remember, you don't have to get married. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes and what it means to stay single. And I'll tell you, it's better. That's what I believe. I think we have to rebuild, reimagine a rich social life for men as single people. Now, reading from the top. Why getting a top job dramatically increases a woman's chances of divorce. Isn't that interesting? We just found out that most women don't really want to work. They want an indentured servant. And then the indentured servant's money, of course, we found out is the marriage money, which really ultimately means hers. So she's getting money for free. Now, when a woman gets a top job, in other words, a job paying more than her husband, she wants a divorce. Exactly. Because she's making more than her indentured servant. She needs an indentured servant. If she's going to profit from her indentured servant, he needs to be making more money than her. Okay, I've got to take care of a little problem here. Just bear with me a second. I just backed something up here. Be right back with you here, folks. Now, reading this from the top, promotion to a top job in politics increases the divorce rate of women, but not for men. And women who become CEOs divorce faster than men who become CEOs, notes Joanna Rickney, a professor at Stockholm University and co-author of the research. Exactly. What does that tell you? Reading this from the top, when a wife knows she can rely on her husband, whether or not she's employed herself, her respect for him comes naturally. At the end of the day, what she wants is to feel cared for. Well, yeah, an indentured servant by nature will care for you. I'm going to pause here for a moment and recognize Harry Hallbrook for his generous donation to Studio Burley. Harry says, never support your local land whale. Marriage is for simps in the modern world. And I think there is a better way or better ways that people can reimagine how to take care of raising children. Because just because we do away with the institution of marriage doesn't mean that we have to give up on the biological drive to reproduce. There are other ways. What is critical about male-female relationships and satisfying those biological drives is that any children need to be properly taken care of, and that can be reimagined. How that is done can be reimagined without the institution of marriage. Let's read on here. When this dynamic breaks down for whatever reason, the husband is unemployed or the wife earns more. Listen to how those two things now are put as equals. The husband is unemployed. Okay, that's pretty serious. If they're not able to pay the bills together, or the wife earns more. In other words, this dynamic breaks down if the man isn't earning as much as the woman or more than the woman. Now that tells you a lot right there. That tells you that Suzanne Venker is basically admitting that every woman wants an indentured servant who makes more money. She has to profit financially from the marriage. She has to profit. She has to get more than she would otherwise get financially from the marriage. Or divorce is almost always inevitable. So read that again. When this dynamic breaks down for whatever reason, the husband is unemployed or the wife earns more. The wife earns more, the resentment sets in the woman, and the respect and the sex fall away. So you hear that, guys? You better be more successful financially in your career than your wife, or she will not respect you and the sex will fall away. Divorce is almost always inevitable. Now tell me, why should a man voluntarily enter this relationship? It is literally, legally as well, indentured servitude, designed to profit the woman and only the woman, and designed to encourage men to sacrifice themselves in order to stabilize society by supporting and profiting women. This has been written about in many, many other places, but let's go on from there. That's all I have to say about Suzanne Venker. I'm going to say that this bit of shaming men and blaming men, we've had enough of it. And marriage has now been corrupted to such a degree that there's nothing left to rescue from it. It's dead. It just needs to be buried. We've got at our cultural table, we've got a corpse sitting there and it's stinking up the entire culture. Put an end to it. Now, let us carry on into having a look at what ways in which our articles or news articles are shaming and blaming men in this situation. And then we'll get on to what the single life might look like. This article, 2 years ago, is marriage really on the decline because of men's cheap access to sex? Again, blaming men, not mentioning that marriage now really doesn't offer men very much. And here, Mother Jones, marriage is declining because men are pigs. Now, they can't blame men much more than that, can you? It's not that there's anything like high risk from marriage. Men are just pigs, says this idiot. And I'll just pop a couple of comments on the screen here. Steve isn't MGTOW. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to call yourself MGTOW. If MGTOW means man going your own way, I think I'm going my own way, whatever that means. What that means to me. It doesn't mean what he says is wrong. And because he isn't MGTOW means that what he's saying carries more weight to other non-MGTOWs. Well, I'll say this. I am going my own way. Whether that fits into other people's view of what going your own way means, I don't have any control over that. So let's have a look at who this guy, Kevin Drum, is. Here he is. He calls himself on Twitter a political blogger, writer for Mother Jones. If you know Mother Jones, it's a rabidly radical feminist blog site. And here he is displaying his 2 cats. There's another one above his picture, which I didn't get on the shot here. And that's probably as far as Kevin Drum is going to go in life. Here's his Friday cat blogging, just last Friday. And here, the Wall Street Journal. Cheap sex and the decline of marriage. Why is marriage a retreat among young Americans? Because it is now much easier for men to find sexual satisfaction outside of marriage, argues this fellow here. And this is trying to paint men in a selfish light and women as victims, of course. And here, in this article here, these links are all in the description of the video. Why men resist marriage even though they benefit the most from it. That really depends how you look at marriage, doesn't it? Men benefit the most from marriage. I would say men risk by far the most from marriage. But at the end of the day, marriage treats men as indentured servants. And here, National Review suggests, hey guys, put a ring on it. Well, I'll say to you guys, just say no to that drug. Here, from reading from the top from that article, it says here, it claims here anyways, married men are healthier, wealthier, and happier with their sex lives. I doubt it. Maybe at some times, maybe in the honeymoon period, but it is a well-known fact that once you get married, the sex falls out of your relationship. This has been published all over the place. Reading onwards, marriage is not worth it. It's not worth the financial sacrifices, the loss of sexual opportunities, and the lack of freedom. All in all, it's a ball and chain of little benefit to any man interested in pursuing happiness and well-being. This is the view that we've encountered from many young men of late. And of course, that's a problem for those who want to continue the historical marriage which is now become indentured servitude for men. They certainly want to counteract that problem. They see it as a problem. So what is this single life? We're going to start here and have a look at an article in The Atlantic. And this was written by a woman. I don't recall whether she's a feminist or not. But this applies to men too. What do you lose when you gain a spouse? What if marriage is not the social good that so many believe and want it to be? And this is the important point. By focusing on traditional marriage as the only sanctioned couple way to pursue pursue satisfaction in life, we are discouraging people from investigating and talking about and imagining other ways. What is it that we really want in life? Well, we do want intimacy, most people. We want an excitement. Most of us want to reproduce. We want to have a child or two or three, who knows? But does that mean that marriage is the best way to do that anymore? Our culture, and especially in the first world, and I'm really talking about the first world here, has changed enormously since the invention of traditional marriage. Why do we think that traditional marriage necessarily needs to be the vehicle for these things today? There's no reason for that to be the default or the best way. So let's have a look at what Sandy here has to say in The Atlantic. Reading this quote from the top. The Pew Research Center reports that only about half of Americans over 18 are married. This is down from 72% in 1960. One obvious reason for this shift is that on average, people are getting married much later in life than they were just a few decades earlier. That's a good point. Now, let's read onward here. The notion that marriage is the best answer to the deep human desire for connection and belonging is incredibly seductive. It is seductive. Thing is that it's not necessarily true. Let's read on. In his majority opinion in Obergefell versus Hodges, Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, "Marriage responds to the universal fear that a lonely person might call out only to find no one there. It offers the hope of companionship and understanding and assurance that while both still live, there will be someone to care for the other." It's a very insightful point. It is the universal fear. And in my experience, fear, responding to fear, giving into fear is a terrible way to make decisions for your life. It is a terrible way. But here he's admitting that marriage responds to the universal fear that a lonely person might call out only to find no one there. And it is only a fear. It is a fear. And marriage does not, in fact, grant that fear, as we will soon see. There are millions of men in horribly lonely marriages, worse than being alone. They are tortured in their loneliness by the ever-presence of a woman who has nothing but hatred for him, despises him, resents him, and destroys the peace of his household every single day. This happens. This is common. We need to talk about it. We need to face the facts that marriage does not solve the problem of potential loneliness as a single person. Not by a long stretch. Let's have a look at another quote from the article. As Chekhov put it, if you're afraid of loneliness, don't marry. Don't marry. I can attest that in my time living with my son's mother and in my time being married, that some of those long stretches of misery were the loneliest periods of my life. So Chekhov put it quite accurately here. If you're afraid of loneliness, don't marry. It is very accurate. Let's read on at the top here. The sociologist Natalia Sarkeesian of Boston College and Naomi Gerstle of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst found that marriage actually weakens other social ties. Let's read that again. Marriage actually weakens other social ties. Compared with those who stay single, married folks are less likely to visit or call parents and siblings, and less inclined to offer them emotional support or pragmatic help with things such as chores and transportation. They are also less likely to hang out with friends and neighbors. And that becomes a pattern, my friends. That becomes a pattern, and then those friends and neighbors drift away, and those relationships become almost impossible to reestablish later. It becomes a self-fulfilling, a self-perpetuating and progressing machine. I'm going to pause here for a moment and recognize Michael Keller for his generous donation to Studio Brûlé. And Michael says, there are many reasons for a divorce. Main reason is and will always be the marriage. Yep. Marriage is the number one cause of divorce. Now, we're going to, that doesn't mean that if you stay single, you're naturally going to be not lonely or ever lonely. There's loneliness is going to be a part of just about every person's life at one time or another, for most people. Not absolutely everyone. Some people are just blessed from cradle to grave in life, and they don't experience the range of troubles that the rest of us do. But let's read on in this article. Single people, by contrast, are far more connected to the social world around them. On average, they provide more care for their siblings and aging parents. They have more friends. They are more likely to offer help to neighbors and ask for it in return. I have noticed this in my travels when I've gone on vacations, and especially when I wasn't married and wasn't living with a woman, I traveled often alone with nothing but a bag or a backpack. And when I traveled alone, I met more people. I met people everywhere I went. If I didn't want to be alone, I wasn't alone. When you're alone, people not only come up to you, but you're more inclined to approach other people on your vacations. And I've done this in Europe. I've done this through Canada and the US and the Caribbean. When you travel alone, you will meet a lot more people. And that is the same, the same kind of concept carries through for single people in life as well. And let's read on here. It isn't the circumstances of married life that isolates, it's marriage itself. Marriage itself isolates people, especially men. Men who are often working long hours, and when they come home, they are just hungry and tired. They don't have the energy to sustain and build a social life, and men then end up relying on their wives to create the social life, to build social or schedule social events. Men have lost the energy, then eventually lose the interest or the drive to even sustain their own social life. The problem is that for an individual, it doesn't work that way. You cannot build a social life through somebody else's efforts. Your wife will have a great social life. She has all the time in the world. She's at home all day. She's busy going to tea with Jane next door and meeting the girls at the spa. Her social life is built continuously throughout her life, while the man is out at war in the workplace, coming home dead tired and hungry, and he doesn't really have the energy to sustain that social life. This happens very commonly. You may get home and then be nagged all day. Let's read this from the top. DePaulo thinks people are hungry for a different story, and I agree. She argues that an emphasis on marriage means people often overlook other meaningful relationships. Let's read that again, because this is so true. An emphasis on marriage means people often overlook other meaningful relationships. Meaningful, deep friendships. Look what happens to Harry, our Prince Harry, our ex-Prince Harry. Overlook other meaningful relationships, deep friendships, roommates, chosen families, and wider networks of kin. These relationships are often important sources of intimacy and support. I 100% agree with this. And let's read on from the top. And then we'll go to one other marriage here. One other article on this topic. Love is the marrow of life, and yet so often people attempt to funnel it into the narrow channels prescribed by marriage and the nuclear family. And though this setup is seen as a cultural norm, it is not, in reality, the way most Americans are living their lives. The 2 parents plus kids family represents only 20% of households in the US. Couples, both married and unmarried, without children are another 25%. But millions of Americans are living alone with other unmarried adults or as single parents with children. It's worth considering what would happen if they lived in a culture that supported all intimate relationships with the same energy currently devoted to celebrating and supporting marriage. That is true. We have to give up on this idea that marriage is the most sacred union possible for a man or a woman. And we have to recognize that marriage has become indentured servitude for the man, who stands to lose everything if his wife becomes unhappy. And in the divorce court will reward the wife, or actually, I'm calling it compensate her for the loss of her indentured servant. That indentured servant was supposed to last her his entire life. But by choosing to leave or choosing to kick him out, the courts compensate her for the loss of her indentured servant. That is not the way to have an intimate relationship for a man. You will have a better chance of close bonds and intimate relationships and a fulfilling life outside of marriage than inside of marriage in most cases. And I'm going to make this point too. The very fact that our culture has put in the red button of nuclear destruction under the finger of every married woman that destroys the life of that man. Our culture has put a gun in the hands of the wife and pointed the gun at the head of her husband. He knows it. She knows it. And that prevents any possibility of a true intimate relationship from forming. It is a relationship of master and slave. She has the power of destruction, and he is the one who gets destroyed. So I will contend here that for men, you can have a better, more fulfilling, intimate life outside of marriage than inside of marriage. And let's read on in this article here. This woman says, no to marriage, not a good deal or not even on the table. The reason for living single that CNN just can't imagine. And I put this up here, and this is from a woman's point of view. She's claiming that single women are like this, and that may be the case for some single women as well. There are single women who don't want to get married. The majority who do want to get married really are just looking for what Suzanne Venker says, a provider and protector, an indentured servant. But this also applies to men, this article. And the main thrust of this is that we need to open our minds to reimagine how we can satisfy our needs and drives towards intimacy and procreation. Now that we live in a world that is dramatically different, we are not faced with imminent destruction. We have a rich and prosperous first world culture, and yet we are dragging this dead institution of marriage around, rotting up the culture. There are other ways to provide for these needs for men and women. So let's read a couple of quotes from this article. To many people who choose to live single, they are not doing so because they are putting marriage aside or because marriage, quote, does not offer a good deal anymore. Marriage was never on the table. She's speaking specifically to women in this article. And for men, a lot of men are deciding not to get married because it does not offer a good deal anymore. It is very true there for men. Reading this from the top, there are still more than 1,000 federal laws that benefit or protect only those people who are legally married. And that's just the legal stuff. There are social, cultural, and interpersonal penalties too, as well as biases in the workplace, our universities, our places of worship, in advertising, in politics, in the media, and in everyday life. All of these things are trying to push men into indentured servitude. The laws right now generally are against men. But in this case, she's complaining about the thousands of laws that benefit or protect only those people that are legally married. And those people who are protected by being legally married are mostly women, not men. So that's all of the prepared material, or rather the screen captures that I have for you today, folks. My main message here is that really at the crux of all of this is that we need to pursue ways and reimagine ways for men to have rich and satisfying lives, to pursue their drive and desires for intimacy and procreation that are not dependent on marriage. We need to recognize that marriage, in fact, for men is indentured servitude. Avoid it, but also reimagine how you can pursue your other natural drives without resorting to the ridiculous indentured servitude that is today's marriage. Thank you, Michael, for pointing out, reminding me to remind folks to help Steve stay caffeinated. I always like your reminder, Michael. Hit the like button, share the video, and consider sending a donation. I couldn't agree more. So Steve can afford patriarchal coffee to continue his work. As we know, keeping me caffeinated does speed up my talking rate, I think. So it's in your best interest. And I would like to end this, as I usually end these lately, to remind folks, and this is very, very important. I can't overstate the importance of this, because this really aided my survival through some of the most difficult times in facing family court and all the rest of those stuff, which I self-represented for. Do something you love every single day without exception. If you don't have something you love to do, find something you love to do. When I was first hit with some of the disastrous divorce court or family court stuff, it's almost 20 years ago now. But when I first did, a friend asked me to join this band. It was like a school band type thing. It was after hours, doing a school band, but brass band. And I said, well, I don't really play a brass instrument, but they lent me a trumpet, and I picked up the trumpet, and I started practicing it every day. And that was a huge escape for me. I started playing it, going to jazz open stages and trying my hand at that. Of course, I made lots of errors along the way. But the point is that I also met people doing that. It also gave me something to look forward to. And it was very, very enriching. I ended up playing joining a jazz duo in a restaurant gig from time to time, just adding a little trumpet fill in the background. So the point is, do something you want to do and you love to do every single day. It's very important for your mental health, especially when things and times are very stressful, especially then. So until tomorrow, join me again for Coffee with Steve Gourlay, and stay safe out there and get down, do something you love. See you guys later.